Today we will consider certain things bound up with the plastic element of speech, with a method of speaking which gradually leads over into the realm of art. When studying eurythmy, it is essential to understand the inner nature of all that is bound up with speech, and consequently with visible speech also. Speech may really be said to lie midway between thinking and feeling. Thinking lies on the one side, feeling on the other. As human beings, we have the inward experience of both thought and feeling. And when we express ourselves outwardly, when we try to bring something to external expression in speech, we really place speech midway between the two elements of thought and feeling. Naturally, when walking in ordinary life, it is not necessary to bother about these details. In eurythmy, however, everything must become conscious. Of course, such things as these only become really clear when they are practically applied. This leads us over to a fact which must be considered if we are really to enter into the nature of speech eurythmy, a fact that is deeply impressed into all that is connected with the more artistic aspect of speech. We have within our modern civilization two types of language, prose and poetry. The further we go back in human evolution, the more we find that poetical language is really the only language, and that the human being, when speaking, has the longing to bring into his speech the element of poetry, the artistic element. And today I shall speak of the essential difference between these two types of language, between poetic language, which must be given artistic shape and form, and prose language, which depends entirely upon the intellectual content, and where there is no longer any necessity to give artistic form to the language as such. During the course of the last few centuries, as materialistic thought developed, for the abstract thought of materialism is closely bound up with the prose element, the true feeling for the artistic shaping and forming of language was lost. And today we find any number of people having absolutely no feeling for the artistic, plastic element of language. They only regard language as a medium for the expression of thought, and are quite indifferent to the quality of the quality of the language through which this thought is expressed. I should not enter into all these things so fully if they were not of the deepest significance for the understanding of eurythmy. For in speaking about eurythmy and taking the sounds as our starting point, we must enter at once into the realm of art. We must bring the inner soul nature of the sounds to outward expression. We must, as it were, go back to a time in which man felt in the word itself all that he experienced in his soul as sound, to a time in which there really was a true language of sound. Today there is no longer a true language of sound. We have instead an intellectualistic language, which only serves to express concepts and thoughts. And this is the reason why today in recitation and declamation, people no longer perceive the artistic, plastic element in language, the musical element, the form-giving element, but make the mistake of looking only for the meaning, of emphasizing the meaning, which is of course also present in prose. It is essential for every eurythmist to gain a true perception of the difference between poetic or artistic language and the language of prose. For the mere understanding, it is of course a matter of no importance as to whether the wording of an idea is beautiful or ugly, as to whether or no words create a noble impression. But for an artistic forming and shaping of speech, it is just these shades of feeling and character which are so important. And this is why we must strive to gain an understanding of the artistic, plastic formation of language. The first step toward this understanding is the development of an inner feeling for the iambic and trochaic rhythms. With the trochaic rhythm, we have to do with thinking. This thinking naturally manifests itself in action, but thought is really the dominant factor. will, striving, predominates in the iambic measure. Thought, the realization of thought, in the trochaic measure. You must not, of course, carry these indications to extremes, but if you really enter into the nature of the different rhythms, you will find what I have said to be correct. Bring the iambic and trochaic rhythms into walking. In the rhythms, we have the time element. The time element is, in this way, brought to eurythmic expression. And the possibilities of eurythmy are so great just because the eurythmist is able to make simultaneous use of both time and space. It is possible, to some extent, even with one eurythmist, but with a group much more so, to bring into eurythmy all manner of variations of forms by means of symmetry, by the grouping of the people in some special form, and by the symmetrical movement of the arms and legs. The solo eurythmist also can create forms in space, but the effect of group forms is much more powerful. The possibilities of group forms are infinitely greater. By means of such forms, by means of this working in space, one is able to enter into the poetic element of speech even more easily, more unhampered than is possible in recitation and declamation. Truly, recitation and declamation must also work toward the inner artistic element inherent in speech, but here the difficulties are greater than in the case of eurythmy. The essential thing about prose language is that it enables one clearly to understand and grasp what one wishes to express by means of a word or sentence. At least one must believe one has grasped it. In prose language we have become so extreme in our desire for clarity that we make use of the so-called definition. There's really something appalling about definitions, for they make people believe that they have clearly expressed some idea, whereas in reality the description is merely pedantic. If people are themselves not clear about the meaning of a word, definitions will be of no help to them. In any case, a comprehensive definition, even of a relatively simple thing, would necessarily lead one into endless complication. Otherwise the results would be similar to the story that I have so often repeated, in which somebody described the human being as a two-legged creature without feathers. On the following day this person was confronted with a goose and told that according to his definition the goose was a human being, for it had 2 legs and no feathers. You see, it was a plucked goose. Now a human being is not always a goose, so here the definition did not meet the case. When using prose language, one should at least attempt to express one's ideas directly, in clear outline. This way of speaking cannot and need not be retained in the artistic formation of language. An artistic treatment of language demands imagination and fantasy, and here one should strive to use one's gift of fantasy, to give rein to one's imagination. This, however, can only be attained when one does not rest content with crude description, but when one develops an attitude of mind which allows imagination and fantasy to give form and life to whatever may be in question. If anyone were to say, for instance, "Here is a water lily," he would be speaking prose. But if he were to say, "Oh, flowering swan," this would be pictorial, poetical. One can quite well picture a water lily, with its white bloom rising out of the water, as a flowering swan. The picture can also be reversed, and here I will quote from Herbal. The lines in which he describes the swan as a floating water lily are perhaps the most beautiful he has written. O Wasserrose, die blühende Schwan. O Schwan, die schwimmende Rose. O water lily, thou flowering swan. O swan, thou floating lily. Even this can hardly be said to be an adequate picture, but at any rate it brings us much nearer to the truth. Now, how does this picture of the flowering swan arise? The expression flowering swan is only an image. It is not in accordance with reality. A picture must have this quality. It must make us feel that it goes beyond reality and give us an impression which transcends its own imagery. The fact that a swan is not a blossom makes the expression flowering swan into a picture. It is when we feel that there is something suggestive about the picture that we are brought closer to the true nature of that which is being described. The inner plastic element of language depends upon this possibility of imagery. And you, my dear friends, will be able to discover this pictorial element when you realize that a sound is, in itself, always a picture. A sound is no less a picture of what it describes than this expression of the flowering swan is a picture of the water lily. But the connection between the sound and what it represents does not rest on an abstraction, but on life itself. Thus it may be said that the use of language is based upon the fact that every sound is a picture, an image of what it wishes to describe. If then we accustom ourselves to see pictures in sounds, we shall learn by degrees to have a feeling for the use of these pictures. We shall learn to know that poetic language, artistic, plastic language, must be pictorial in character. It is not difficult to form such pictures as these. They generally go by the name of metaphor. A metaphor is, in reality, a picture which makes use of some common characteristic or characteristics in order to experience what two things to be portrayed have in common. In such a case, one portrays one thing by describing it as something else, which is not the thing to which one is really referring, but has certain characteristics in common with it. Metaphor arises in this way. There's a drawing. I am purposely not giving the usual definition of the metaphor, for this definition has nothing artistic about it. My description is not based upon logic, but I have tried to build it up from what is really essential. Let us go a little further. It is possible, by making use of a word which represents something less comprehensive, to express something really wider in its meaning. For instance, one can mean beasts of prey. But if one wishes to be more pictorial, instead of actually using this expression, one might equally well say the lions. When, in using the word lion, one really intends to convey the meaning of beasts of prey, language becomes pictorial. We must be clear that in such a case, the lesser is used to describe the greater. We wish to give the impression of what is more comprehensive, but in order to do so, we use a word which expresses something more limited. This pictorial means of expression is very general. It is called the synecdoche. In the synecdoche, we have a picture in which one makes use of the lesser to express the greater. Conversation is really of the nature of metaphor.